Alright, so after about 2 weeks of hard work, intense labor, and bewilderment, I was scratching my head a lot during the process. But finally I was able to remove the transaxle, and here it is, on my scale, weighing in at 110 pounds. It sure did take a while, but I got all the old clutch and related components out of there. Then installed a new flywheel, new clutch disc, new throw-out bearing, and during the process I was a little bit worried that I was going to make a mistake, the car would never run again or never be the same again, but I was worried for nothing because when I went to go start it, she fired right up. Drove around for a while and it ran perfect. Shifting, really good. I love the single mass conversion kit. So what I did is I started inside the car here with the steering. I removed that one bolt there. Not the bolt up here. Don't touch anything up there. Just the one at the bottom. Also, you're going to want to get a marker or something and mark the area where the male and female is. Mark it up with something so you can use your marking as a reference when you go to assemble everything back together. Then I went outside under the hood. I removed the 2 hoses at the bottom of the power steering reservoir. Drain out all the fluid. Once the fluid's out, you can remove the nut here for the high pressure line. Then the return line has to be removed down by where it's connected to the subframe. Battery, take it right out of there. Same thing with the intake, it's got to come out, the whole thing. Remove it, put it aside. Once the battery and airbox are out, you can see the top of the transmission. There's a reverse light sensor here. Remove that harness for the reverse light sensor right here. If you want, you can take out the whole reverse light sensor. It just screws out. And there's a vehicle speed sensor. You have to remove the harness for that or take it all out. It's your choice. 2 pieces. And I'll just remove it all so you can see what it looks like inside. After that, I went on to the shift cables over by the driver's side firewall. 2 of them shift and select cable. Just remove the cotter pin from behind there and slide them free. Put them aside. After that, I did drain out all the clutch fluid, and then I removed those 2 bolts for the slave cylinder. Took that out of there. And the arm. Make sure you remove that entire arm. There's just a bolt on top. Take it off of there. Before raising the car up on jack stands, I loosened up all the lug nuts and I took out the cotter pin for the axle nut. On both sides of the car, and then I raised the car off the ground. I used a couple jacks and a couple jack stands. Chocked the rear wheels. With the jack stand almost at their highest setting, I managed to raise the car about almost a couple feet off the ground, and that was just enough to get the transaxle out. With the car now raised up, I removed the brake caliper. There's 4 bolts in total, 2 for the caliper and 2 for the, what's it called again, bracket. And then the rotor came off. After that, I unhooked and disconnected the ABS sensors. Next up was the lower tie rod end and the cotter pin has to be removed and heat it, hose it down with penetrating oil if you have to. Once you get the nut off, just put it on in reverse, and you can hit it with a hammer, or you can do what I did and just jack it up with a jack. See, I put a jack underneath here and I just lifted it up with the jack, and then I hit with a hammer from the top, and it came off first try. Then the steering knuckle, 2 bolts, could be really tough, and I heated mine for a long time. Took about a couple hours, but they came off. Once that was done, I was able to get the drive shaft out, but it slid out by the boot rather than out of the transaxle. So here's what that looked like. Before I put the axles back on, I'm going to clean out all the old grease and then repack it with a newer, better quality grease. There's a little groove on the axle. You can see here, that's what holds it in. After removing the driver's side, I went on to the passenger side, half axle. Took probably almost an hour and a screwdriver to pry it apart, but eventually it did come apart. Once that comes off, then you have to remove the bolts that are securing the intermediate shaft. There's a couple of them and they're sort of hard to get to, so here's how I attached my ratchet, just like that. And then I used an extension bar, attached it onto that, and just turned it like a quarter turn at a time, so it took a while, but it came out. After removing the intermediate shaft, I went underneath the car and drained out the oil. Just a couple feet over is the starter motor. That's got to come out, and it's a couple bolts, 3 of them, and there's one long ass bolt on the left side there of the shield. Once you get the shield out, then you can just take out the ground and the power wire, remove the one harness, and there's 2 bolts that are connecting it to the flywheel pretty much. So I'll show you what that looks like. It's actually 1 nut and 1 bolt. So once you get it out, you just hit the bolt with the hammer and it should just come right off. So now with the starter removed, you can see inside where it was sitting. And just by looking inside with the amount of debris inside, you can tell that the clutch is worn out because there's a lot of debris inside and it's all the clutch friction material. Inside of the starter too. So I just vacuumed it all out before reinstalling it. I ended up boosting it with some battery cables just to see what it looked like when it worked. So getting down to the nitty-gritty now, the engine mounts are up next, and I got some new ones because my old rare mount was cracked, and it's just not a good mount, and you can see it's got holes in it all around. This is the OEM mount. Here's the new one I got from Rock Auto. It's solid. Compared to the old one, the new one is solid rubber rather than having holes in it. But before removing the engine mounts, make sure you reposition your jacks and stands to support the engine and the transmission especially. So, just to go back a bit, sorry, I'm going to reiterate. Looking at the front of the transmission here, this is where you drain the oil. This is your shift fork where the lever goes. Here's your reverse sensor, and you got your speed sensor over here. And what you don't want to do is remove these bolts over here to the right of the fork, because that'll separate the transmission, and it won't separate the transmission from the engine. What you want to do is separate the transmission from the engine. If you remove these bolts here, then you're going to end up taking it apart. But you want to separate it from the engine rather than take it apart. So don't remove the bolts to the right of the fork. These ones here, take off the ones on the other side over here to the left of the fork. There's a bunch of them, 1, 2, 3, couple over there. They're more hidden. 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's say there's about a dozen of them, and they're different sizes. So keep track of what goes where, because they're different size bolts, and when you go to reinstall it, it's important that you put them in the proper place. So for the subframe, there's 2 big bolts in the front, and there's 6 of them in the back. You got to take them all out. Heat them up if you have to, because they could be stuck. As you lower the subframe, the steering will pop out. So drop it down only a little bit and then mark it. Do you remember how earlier we marked inside? We used a marker or something and marked inside when we removed this bolt. Well, do the same thing outside here and mark it. Don't lower it down all the way, just lower it down minimally, like an inch, and then mark it and then lower it down all the way. There's 2 bolts for the front muffler. Heat them, and they may take a while, but you'll get them off. And that was it. Almost 2 weeks later, after removing all that stuff, I was able to get the transaxle out through the driver's side wheel well. Here's a look at the Flywheel OEM. This is the one that came with the car. There's clutch friction material inside there, and the disc is scratched up. Clutch disc is completely worn. It wouldn't even grip anymore. It just slipped and slipped. And here's a look at all the stuff removed. So if you guys are planning on doing something like this, then it took me 2 weeks. So keep in mind it might take you, it may or may not take you that long. But I wish you guys the best of luck and hope this helped somebody, anybody. And if I get any new information, I'll pass it along. And we can keep these cars running as long as we can.